back with you once again on the India Development Debate right here on ET Now. I'm Supriya Shrinate, and we now put the spotlight on the first board meeting of the RBI steered by the new governor Shaktikanta. He's hit the ground running, it seems, within days after taking over the reins at Mint Street. He chaired a meeting of the central bank's board of directors today, discussing the crucial issue of NBFC liquidity amongst many other things. Sources tell ET Now that the board also took stock of the NPA provisioning required by PSU banks for the December and the March quarters, although no decision was taken on a proposal review of the much talked about prompt corrective action framework for weak banks. Another topic that dominated the day's proceedings was capital infusion in weak state-owned lenders, and the message, it seems, is clear. The central bank will be a facilitator rather than an adversary, and there is always a communication channel open with the government, which in his own words is much more than a stakeholder. The winds of change at Mint Street and what they will mean for the banks and the Indian economy at large is a big topic of discussion and debate right here on the India Development Debate this evening. Mr. R. Gopalan, former Secretary, Department of Economic Affairs, joins us. He's also the former Finance Secretary of India. Mr. Pradeep Chaudhary, former Chairman of SBI, R. Jagannathan, Editorial Director, Swarajya Magazine, and Maithili Bhusnur, our consulting editor. Thank you very much, each one of you, for being with us. And Mr. Gopalan, if I may start with you, will you see this? It's a very terse sort of a press release that came. We spoke to our sources on the board, and we're given to understand liquidity, provisioning, governance, and all of those things were discussed. Obviously, no substantive decisions taken just yet. Will you believe this is a status quo, or will you believe this is a sign of peace and normalcy return in relationship between the central bank and the central government?
Oh, I see this as a very welcome step, and normalcy in relationship between government and Mint Street developing now, and that's good for the entire banking system, especially when you are faced with problems in the financial sector with the provisioning and your liquidity issues, which are, now certainly going to show their face. And obviously on the economy side, with food deflation troubling in a very, very big way. So there are issues, and I believe the economic position of the country was also discussed, and the challenges facing the internal and external sector, they were also discussed, apart from the liquidity and other currency management and those kind of issues. So if you look at all this, I think all in all, it's a good meeting, but I also feel that government is not going to let go of the pressure on the governance issues, which has its own implications as we go along or go forward in the RBI's functioning.
No, fair point indeed. But very quickly, before I go any further, if I can get Pradeep Chaudhary into this debate. And Mr. Chaudhary, given that, many people thought Shaktikanta Das as a government appointee will come in, will start taking decisions, the board is now going to be swayed by him and all of that. Deliberations were done, and it looks like a channel of communication is on. It is perhaps a little more amicable than it was earlier. But have fears around, the governor being pliant, or the governor being the government's rubber stamp and all of that is gone, or is it too early to judge?
No, the first sentence that you said was very important, that RBI now on would be a facilitator rather than a hindrance. In fact, that is what is required, that RBI should have a problem-solving mindset. Supposing at some point they say, no, we can't go beyond this, that's understandable. But unilaterally changing rules, not informing anybody, and this PCA norms being tightened, the capital norms being tightened, unilaterally, suddenly as a bolt from the blue. So those things should be over. I think whatever the decisions have to be in the interest of prudence in banking, but these would be deliberated, discussed, and thrown in the public, if not thrown in the public domain, but would have a larger discussion and debate.
Okay. Maithili, let me come to you, and I think the touchy issues is really governance, and on that, if I may quote, it very categorically says that the board deliberated on the governance framework of the Reserve Bank, and it was decided that the matter required further examination. Now, there are two ways to look at it. If you are a government basher, you will say that for the first time, the RBI is openly admitting that there is a change of supervision, change of board's role that's required. If you're on the other side, you would say a decision hasn't been taken, and they're still open to perhaps deliberating upon this and not doing it eventually? How will you read into it?
Well, yes, the statement, the press communique is certainly very bland, and to the extent that it doesn't, you can interpret it either way. It does lead, you know, you can decide depending on how you want to look at it, whether you want to see it as a sign that the Reserve Bank of India is willing to look at it, or as a sign that the Reserve Bank of India could not decide. But to the extent that I said it is an admission that they are, you know, looking at it itself is one step forward. But it bears, by and large, the press release does bear the stamp of a bureaucrat, because it uses words like deliberated, reviewed, and then thought it requires more time. But at the same time, I think one should not expect dramatic changes, and to the extent that the new governor is willing to take time until he settles into the seat, because remember, this is new territory for him, I would think it's a good beginning, Supriya.
Okay, good beginning indeed. Let's get out of the substantive issues, and Jaggi, if I may come to you on some of those substantive issues, and one of them, of course, is ECF. There is no clarity on the formation of the committees on critical issues. What does it signify? Because it does, you know, there is talk about deliberation and discussion on current economic situation, global and domestic challenges on the economy, matters relating to liquidity, credit outflow and all of that. But not a word on, you know, who's going. And I was speaking to a source of mine. It's not there in the public release, but I was speaking to some sources, and they said that it has been decided that the governor and the central government officials will work together on the appointment of the committee. It will be time bound and things like that, like I think the finance minister said earlier today. What do you make of this?
I think the purpose of this meeting was to establish the sense that the governor is willing to listen to the board and what it has to say, and also it wanted to send a message that look, and I think he could have easily postponed it, saying I have just taken over, we could have held it later, but it deliberately was not postponed, because I think the governor wanted to say that okay, I am there, I am willing to talk, let's discuss and various things. The most important word there is the issue of governance, which for the first time has come into a Reserve Bank press release, into a Reserve Bank board press release, which means that issue is going to be important and it will get resolved. I think the purpose of attending this meeting is that it will now give the governor and the government time to actually meet behind the scenes, have their confabulations in terms of what committees, its composition, how they will deal with certain issues that the government is very concerned about, so that when the next board meeting happens, I think many of these things will have been thrashed out behind the scenes. The purpose is not to thrash it out in the board meeting, but to give time for the government and the governor to actually discuss these things quietly behind the scenes without letting the world know about it, and then come to some sensible conclusion. Then it can be brought to the board and it can also do. So the idea is to give the governor and the government time to assess each other and see which are red lines in the relationship, which are the important things they will take up first and how they will do. I think it gives them time to move in that direction, so that by the time you have the next board meeting, I think most of these issues would have probably been thrashed out and it will be brought in. That is the purpose.
Okay, let me now move the debate to some substantive issues, and I think one of the substantive issues has to be liquidity. And Mr. Gopalan, given your previous avatar and your experience with this, the board reviewed inter alia the current economic situation, global and domestic challenges, matter relating to liquidity and credit delivery to the economy, issues related to currency management and financial literacy. I will pick up one by one. Let's just talk about liquidity. The fact that this is being discussed is the first sign of the board and perhaps the professional management being open to a liquidity boost. Now, how worried should one be? Because I'm presuming the resistance was not just Governor Patel's or former Governor Patel's. It must have been institutional. It must have been, the deputy governor in charge. It must have been the EDs. I'm just trying to understand from you what really happens as far as liquidity is concerned. Does the statement mean the spigots could be opened up, and is that a dangerous thing to do?
Well, there has always been a difference of opinion between, at least in the recent past, of whether the liquidity is sufficient in the system. And Governor and Mr. Viralacharya were talking about sufficient liquidity is getting infused with the OMOs and those kind of issues, despite the fact that a lot of money had been sucked in, because when the foreign exchange was, the dollars were released in the market. So, but from the industry viewpoint, at the granular level viewpoint, there is still a feeling that liquidity is not sufficient. Now, what requires to be done is if the liquidity is sufficient, are the channels getting clogged in some sense, and how is that going to be released? Probably RBI would have discussed today in the board this issue of how the liquidity, if it is adequate, why the channels are clogged. If it is not adequate, how much more liquidity can be put into the system. These matters, the options, the professional people in the RBI would have put it up before the board, and board would have deliberated on that. Certainly, my view is that the liquidity issue, it's good that it got discussed, because there is no point in people saying in one particular fora that liquidity is not adequate, and somebody saying from the RBI, no, it's adequate, we have done enough, our MPC has reviewed this, and this is what is going to be the scene, and we will do anything and everything to ensure that the liquidity is going to be, available. So, the actual thing now is good that it has been discussed, and since the directors have felt that it is very important issue, and I think the management of RBI will certainly take that into consideration, the feelings expressed by the members, because they have varied experiences in different areas, and they are conveying what they feel on the ground situation. Probably the RBI will certainly look into it, and there is bound to be some movement if liquidity is, in the system liquidity is not going to be adequate to get into at the granular level.
No, I understand from you what you're saying, but essentially this is what the RBI's position has been. They've been saying for a while now that we need to look at system-wide liquidity, and that's adequate. The government meanwhile believes, and perhaps, the elected government of the day, like Mr. Jaitley said yesterday, economic policy of the government needs to be in sync with, what the RBI is doing. Of course, Maitri has a different view on this, and so do a lot of other people, that creative tension is warranted. They shouldn't be seeing eye to eye. But I really want to go across to Mr. Pradeep Chaudhary, because Mr. Chaudhary, in some sense, the liquidity debate will settle, how pliant or non-pliant are things going to be at RBI. And the reason why I say so is because the government has been very open on the liquidity debate, and the RBI has been equally vocal on its reservations about increasing liquidity. The fact that they are now saying things like we are ready to, we're discussing this and all of that, how are you going to read into it? Is there a change of position? Are they more open? What would you say?
The difficulty is that RBI's communication and the rest of the country's communication are at variance. Now, even during demonetization, when people were narrating their real life experience that we are not getting cash, banks are saying that we don't have enough cash, RBI would stick to the line, I have sent 600,000 crores of cash. It is not what you say from the, remember, from the Mumbai office. What the ground reality is. You see all around, till about a month back, there are huge CPs that were in the danger of getting defaulted. And even today, you ask any NBFC, even the banks are, holding back the sanction limits. They are not releasing the full sanction limit, saying that the liquidity is tight. Now, this kind of thing is called a market disruption clause. I am not, conjuring up a very grave scenario, but this is what happened in 2008 when banks said that we have sanction limits, but current market dynamics does not allow us to release the full amount. So therefore, they have to be in the shoes of the user to feel, and given the benign price situation, inflation situation, what is the harm in releasing 2% CRR? That will release 2 lakh crores of liquidity. It doesn't harm anybody. Do you mean the inflation will rocket to 20%? Let us see. If it does, then roll it back. But I'm sure it won't. But this would give more resources to the banks which are strapped for resources. It will put more liquidity to the market participant, and we should not be going by what some people in RBI in their trading desk feels, the volumes in repo market and the volumes in call money market.
Right.
These mean nothing to the common people.
No, absolutely. I think that's important, and I think that's the point that the central government seems to be making as well, that on the ground things are different and the RBI needs to perhaps respond to that. But Maitri, I will come to you, and I'm presuming, and the conversation that we had with people off the record was that provisioning also came up for discussion as far as banks under PC are concerned. Now, I'm really going to take this debate beyond just today's board meeting and refer to a statement that Mr. Goyal, Piyush Goyal made yesterday, and you know, he said that suddenly, without any reference to the board of directors on the 1st of April 2017, RBI drastically changed the prompt corrective action framework. The truth is that's not how it happened. The RBI, I remember very clearly, proposed the revision, I think in September 2016. I think by March 2017, the government wrote back to the RBI saying it was in broad sync. Are you telling me that something like this sort of a public attack by, you know, by a union minister wasn't discussed in the meeting today? Do you think it never came up? People didn't refer to it?
It's very hard to say, Supriya, since the press release is so terse and bland, one really does not know what exactly was the extent of the discussions. But if I could just revert to the issue of liquidity, I think one of the things that's going to come to Governor Das's rescue is the fact that the rupee has stabilized largely. So to the extent that we don't see the kind of weakening of the rupee that we saw earlier, because earlier when the rupee was weakening, the RBI was supplying dollars and withdrawing rupees. So that was also keeping liquidity tight. Now with the relative return of stability to the forex market, I think that kind of pressure on the rupee liquidity will ease, number one. Number two, while Urjit Patel was talking about system-wise liquidity, I think the government's position is that there are certain sectors which are being deprived of liquidity. So even though overall the liquidity might be sufficient, there are certain sections, particularly the MSME sector, which is starved of liquidity. So I think one needs to distinguish between the overall picture and the sectoral picture. And as far as PCA is concerned, one really do not know what was discussed today, but I do hope in fact that future press communiques after the central board meetings, I think they need to be a little bit more detailed, given the fact that the RBI has become the center of the storm for so many months now almost. I think it's important that all minutes are also released, because unlike in the case of the MPC minutes, we really don't get minutes of the central board meeting. So I think it's important that we get minutes, and that the press release after the board meeting is held is also a little bit more detailed. But that's for the future.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and there will be so many stories to be told there, Maithili. I mean, just looking at it from a completely selfish point of view, plenty of stories that will come out of there as well. But 9.5 lines of a press release, I think the RBI can do better. But let me just quickly take this across to Jaggi. And Jaggi, you know, the change in guard at RBI notwithstanding, the kind of public attack that the institution is right now under, and you know, it's almost being made out to be as if everything that Urjit Patel did was wrong. Truth be told, he was the man responsible and perhaps in many ways should be credited for inflation targeting. He headed that committee, stuck to it like a you know, like a hawk, and ensured that inflation targeting was maintained. The reason why I ask this question is that given the public discourse and given the public statements that people like Piyush Goyal have made, changing the rules of the game midway, you know, PCA framework and all of that, I'm just curious to know, does the board also take into account the public glare, the public scrutiny, and may I dare add, the public criticism it is under?
About the board you're talking?
Yes.
Yeah, see, the thing is, the reason why the press communique after the thing was so terse was largely because I think they discussed things in very generalities, and they may have discussed the weather as well. I think the issue really is that they wanted a standstill time where the government and the Reserve Bank officials can actually have a chat and actually move forward. So this is more a standstill discussion meeting. The other thing is, when you talked about the Piyush Goyal attack on Urjit Patel and the sudden thing, I think because the matter has moved into the political sphere, where I think the opposition is claiming that you are destroying an institution like RBI and things like that. So the attack has come actually on Urjit Patel, and it's unlikely that the PCA norms were unknown to the government before the RBI actually issued them. So I think it would have known, but what the government may not have been aware of was how the immediate impact would have been on say credit flows and other things. And so the government's concerns probably surfaced a little later, because the government is not run by an economist, it's run by a group of people, including the politicians, who may not immediately be aware of the impact of what the RBI has done on the PCA. So I think those are the things that are probably left unsaid, and this thing they need to do that. As far as the liquidity concern is there, I think what Pradeep Chaudhary said is bang on. The problem is the RBI deals with everything at the level of a macro number, whereas when you actually see in a country like India with 1.3 billion people and hundreds of NBFCs, the mere fact that 10 of them might be suffering can have a systemic problem. I mean, that's where I think the Reserve Bank is going wrong. Unless you go down to the detail, you will not know what the real problem is, and whereas in the political side you are actually getting that feedback, but you are not getting that in the RBI.
Okay, all right. But you know, I have to talk about credit delivery as well, because those were the other things that were discussed, and I'll take that question up both with Mr. Gopalan and Mr. Pradeep Chaudhary. And credit delivery obviously is a function of, you know, some economic activity and some robustness. There's been some amount of pickup that has happened, and you know, the RBI's constant grouse is that even though we've brought down rates, the transmission hasn't been certain. In that sense, and you know, I do want to ask, do you believe there'll be a certain communication with banks on credit offtake, and how are things there? Because one gets this feeling that the RBI, much like the central government, is a little more focused right now on credit offtake, because they believe that is the best sign of economic activity.
Well, see, one must understand that banks can look at, I mean, the portfolio of credits which they do according to their business plan, they do based on the economy and based on what the board has approved. But once again, you find that banks will definitely go into sectors where now they will watch NPAs will be far less. So the retail loans will get a priority, agriculture may not, with the deflation going down there, and industry, unless they come with firm proposals for project finance, they will not be in a position to consider them. But State Bank chairman has said that number of project proposals, finance for project proposals have come in, and they are examining them. And with the gross fixed capital formation also showing a healthy growth in the last about 2-3 quarters, I get the impression that we have hit the bottom, and investment will start now getting into, especially after capacity utilization has reached 76.1%. Then the question that arises is that on the credit delivery, one would look at which sectors, based on the experience of various people, which sectors are not getting enough credit, which sectors deserve credit at this point in time, and is there anything the banks can do about it. I think that kind of a discussion would certainly have been taken place in the board, and board would have requested RBI management to see how you can ensure if these sectors are growing, and if our information is these sectors are not getting adequate credit, how do you ensure that these sectors get the credit which it requires. So the discussion would have been on those general terms in the board, but ultimately the details have to be worked out. Probably some kind of a understanding would have been reached as to how to go about doing it on in broad terms, and RBI will, the management will work out how this can be implemented.
Fair point. In fact, RBI is likely to release the State of Banking report very soon. And Mr. Pradeep Chaudhary, I'll let you have a quick last word on this. Given the fact that, you know, the banking space cleanup is still very much on, we have nowhere reached the end of this cleanup, and now there are big fault lines in the NBFC space as well. Of course, the worst perhaps is behind us on those counts. Are those issues that you believe will touch upon the minds of board members? And more importantly, I think the other fact that must ask you is currency management apparently was also touched upon, at least this says so, issues related to currency management. The fact that the rupee has stabilized, I'm wondering what sort of discussion happened around that. Mr. Chaudhary?
Actually, again, the problem is that RBI needs to be on the ground. They are somewhere in the stratosphere. Now, in the name of transmission, what kind of complication they have brought in? Each bank has a 1-month base rate, 2-month base rate, 3-month base rate, 4-month, going up to 6 months. This is crazy. It is not there anywhere in the world. Do you mean to say that we are breaking new ground? We are the path breakers, we are the pioneers in this. You have a base rate for short-term lending and a base rate perhaps for a long-term lending. That's also is not there in most countries. But why does RBI have to micromanage? And if the bank rates are high, let me see one single NBFC which is lending lower than the banks. That means the cost of capital, cost of funding and the credit costs have been factored in, and then only there is to be lent. And secondly, this cleanup, you know, people are little impatient about this cleanup, but wherever it has happened, whether it is in South Korea or in EU, the cost has been approximately 2% of the GDP. Now, if our GDP is supposed to be $2 trillion, so maybe you are looking at 2% of that. So that amount of capital would need to be infused. There is no running away from that. So one is that we wish the results, and secondly, the banks, you know, have to be allowed. And now even the customers are so confused that you have a 1 month base rate, 2 month base rate, 6 month, and sometimes the 6 month base rate is lower than 1 month base rate. What's going on? People can't understand this complication. It has to be made available to them in a simple manner. And I think RBI should, you know, shed its this tendency to bureaucratize everything.
Okay. Should shed the tendency to bureaucratize. This is just first of the many meetings that Governor Shaktikanta Das is going to chair. But on that note, completely out of time on this edition of the India Development Debate. We take a quick breather. There's plenty more following up right here on ET Now. Stay right here with us. Thank you very, very much. Maithili Basnurmat, of course, Mr. R. Gopalan, Mr. R. Jagannathan, and Pradeep Chaudhary for being with us in this edition of the show.